Ja, wunderbar. Servus. Der Matthias hat es ja super anmoderiert, dann kann ich ja direkt starten.
So let's look at the following scenario. Okay, Alice wants to connect to Bob, and the two of them want to exchange data, confidential data usually. And of course, there can be an attacker that can come in, he can access the data, and of course that would be very bad. Because of that, the two of them, before they actually exchange confidential data, they should agree on a way to encrypt them. Of course, all of that is only helpful in a certain way, because if this attacker is actually sitting in between the two of them, before anything was encrypted at all, and accesses data then, being the man in the middle, that would be very, very negative, because then the two of them would communicate with the attacker, and the two of them don't even know, because the attacker actually tells them that it's a direct connection. Of course, it's not true, but it just says that it is, and the available data is already there. So what's essentially important here is that this whole connection is then authenticated. So that means that the two of them, so the server and the client, actually are authenticated, and that Alice actually knows that she is talking to the right person. And all of that is then supposed to be done by the SSL protocol, and we're going to have a look at that first. So first of all, some terminology. So is it called SSL or is it called TLS? Well, SSL is a protocol from the 90s, 1996 to be specifically. There was SSL 3.0, and it was then replaced by TLS. And the current version of TLS is 1.2 from 2008, and 2018 we're going to have TLS 1.3, and that's going to replace the old version basically. But everybody still calls it SSL. Of course, sometimes you see SSL on older systems, embedded systems as well, and SSL is also used for advertisement. So if you talk about SSL certificates that you can get, for example, that you can purchase and so on, and all the tools, all the common tools also have SSL in their name. So that is something that's going to stick around for a while. If we look at the TCP/IP protocol stack, that's just an excerpt of that. All of that is an additional transport layer, and it's supposed to do exactly that. It's supposed to do these two jobs: authentication of the members, the two people connecting, and then also the encryption. So if you now look at our use cases in all our applications with TLS, then all of that is called HTTPS, LWS, and so on. And there's also other applications that are compatible. In order to understand everything, I would just like to tell you a little bit about encryption and encryption algorithms, to be specific. There might be symmetric encryption, and the way that works is as follows. So there is a shared secret, that's the symmetric key, and both parties can use that in order to encrypt their messages and send it to the other party, and then they can actually read it using that key. Of course, that's very effective. That's how it's implemented in today's day and age. You can also send large amounts of data with that, but the disadvantage is that you always have to exchange the key. Another thing that's available is asymmetrical keys. That's based on a pair of keys with the characteristics that if you encrypt something using one key, you can only decrypt it using the other key. And usually that's being used in a way that you just have a public key and a private key. And in terms of structure, they're not different. However, the private key is secretive, so it's not known. It's with the server, and it's then sending out the public key to the public, obviously. And everybody that has this public key can then encrypt something with it and can be sure that only the server is able to actually open it or read it, so the private key owner. And now, of course, you might wonder why the client doesn't just say, okay, I'm going to create a pair of keys and I'm going to hand out my public key and the two of them can just communicate very easily. Well, there is a catch, because these procedures are very, very complicated in terms of compute power. So if you have lots of data, for example, websites that you want to access and send out, that is just not possible with it, at least not efficiently. Because of that, in real life, these procedures are always combined, meaning that you usually just use your asymmetrical system. You authenticate it if you want to encrypt it using the private key, and you have the identity and the information, and that can then be read by somebody who has the public key, and then they can be sure that at least it was encrypted with the private key. If then that person trusts it, that person can then create a symmetrical key and then send it to the private key owner, and can be sure that only the person he's sending it to can actually access it and read it. And that way the two of them can switch to symmetrical keys, which is a lot more efficient. So that's sort of the basis of this. The same is true for the TLS protocol. So all of that starts with the TLS Handshake. And structurally, this is what it looks like. So just roughly, the two of them say hello first, and they just exchange some cryptographic information, what the client can do, what the server wants, and so on. So it's just about algorithms that the two of them are choosing. Of course, there's also some random numbers that are exchanged in order for this whole handshake for this is only available for or valid for this session, so it cannot be mirrored by an attacker later on. And the server then sends his server certificate that he uses to identify himself. So how that works exactly, we're going to look at that later on. And it's a little bit more complex, to be honest. So it's also sending his public key. And the client uses that public key and creates a symmetrical key and can then make it available to the server. And the two of them say change server spec, so that means they're now switching to symmetrical systems. The server says finished, and then you can just continue with the encrypted communication. One thing that's still missing is the authentication process, and the X509 infrastructure is doing that, and we're going to have a look at that now. So the basis of that is the digital signature. So how does that work? Just so you know, the server now wants to verify an identity. That means he says, okay, I'm going to use this hashing algorithm, and you get a hash value as a result, and that's supposed to compromise everything a little bit. So what's very important is that it's a cryptographic algorithm, so we can't have any duplicates, and we have different information that then have the same hash value. So that's just not going to happen in this case. So it's now encrypting it using the private key, and the result of that is just the digital signature. The identification process is then happening in a way that the whole information and the identity that has to be verified is then sent to the client together with the signature, so the person that requested it, really, right? So it's made available to them, and they really do the same thing as the server does. So it's just creating a hash value, it's using the same hashing algorithm, and it then decrypts the signature. And if those two values match, then they can be sure that this signature that he just received with this private key was actually encrypted. Now, this whole exchange of keys that is still missing at this point in time, so we just implied that the client knows that this public key is belonging to this private key. That is defined in the X509 infrastructure, so just in that specification. So if you can see down here who thought of that specification. So this whole standard is also available online, so if you want to read that, please feel free to do that. It's as easy to read as a phone book. And the main ingredients of this whole thing are just X509 or SSL certificates, so-called certification authorities. So certification authorities that actually publish these certificates for identities and also servers. And overall, they also need a certificate signing request. So you're sort of requesting that you want to get a certificate for something. So please do verify my identity. I am not going to talk about the last part I just mentioned, because you can find information online as to how to create that that it is just a digital document overall. Okay, now, the main ingredients of such a certificate are the following. So it's the public key from the person who wants to verify their identity, so the certificate owner, and also a signature that confirms the certificate owner. So if the certificate is on a server that I want to connect to, and it says yes, this signature was created and therefore my identity is verified. That's really not helpful to us because anybody can say that, right? So he just signed for himself, basically. Because of that, somebody else has to do it using their private key. That's very, very important. The private key doesn't belong in the certificates itself. It's only used to sign them. And this person or this authority now also has a certificate that is published to them. So we just took it a step further. Somebody else signed for them for our server, right? And we still don't necessarily have to trust them. So that means we can now keep on going with this chain forever because there might be the next person, we might trust that person, whatever. So at one point in time, there is going to have to be an end to this chain. And that would be somebody who signed for themselves. So that's essential because this certificate owner is somebody we need to know. We need to know that we can trust it. That's the only reason why they can sign for themselves. And that they sort of made it where we have the certificate with the public key, which helps us verify this whole chain, and we got it from them personally. So in real life, this is what it looks like. So we talk about root certificates in this case. So these certificates of the person that we actually trust were handed to us in a different way, so differently than the server certificate was handed to us. So usually they are in a browser or with our operating system. And it can also be in the certificate store. And because of that, theoretically, you can ensure that we received it in a different way, right? So we talk about the certificate chain in this case. This whole certificate chain is saved on the server, and the server tells us, I am this one, and they signed for me, and we're talking about server certificates here. We're talking about intermediate certificates right here, or, yeah, certificates. And what I do need in order to verify everything is the root certificate, and that is from a certification authority. That's who published it. And why do I have these intermediate certificates? Because it could also go directly to the root certificate for the server certificate, right? Well, the reason for that would be that there are many different servers that would require a signature. And for that reason, we just have an abstraction layer in here. So that means we have sub-certification authorities that are also eligible to sign. However, the further up we go this chain, the more important it is that this private key doesn't get into the wrong pair of hands. Because if this private key was stolen, for example, or compromised in any way, then of course this whole chain would be worthless because somebody could just sign for it, and of course that wouldn't be helpful for us at all. And for that reason, it's very important that it is kept safely and securely, and that you don't have to sign for so many certificates. Intermediate certificates and all of that is then sort of like a tree structure. Another thing that's interesting is what does a certificate like that look like? What's part of that? We just looked at the main ingredients of it, but of course there's a lot more. So I'm just going to give you some metadata, just some information as to what kind of certificate we're dealing with here. So we have the serial number, we have the validity, that's very important, then also the signature algorithm that everything is based on so that the programs know how to handle it. And the core information, like I said, is the issuer and then also the owner of the certificate, so the subject of the certificate. identified by different areas that you can check. The most important might be the common name, the CM. If I have a server certificate, then this common name is going to have to match the name that I want to connect to in order for everything to be verified. So if I connect to google.de and the common name it says google.com, then of course it's not going to be helpful because the certificate is not issued to the party I want to connect to. And the signature in this case would be the basic information. So those are all areas that are available in the certificate, and of course it's also very important the public key of the certificate owner, the subject. So starting at version 3, that's the current version that you'll find. There are some expansions, and of course they sort of show everything that I might need in order to keep up this whole infrastructure. And yeah, to show it. So we have all the information we need, information like, okay, can this certificate sign for other certificates? If it's a server certificate, at the end of the chain, then nothing's going to be signed anymore. Intermediate certificates do sign. It's also very important to have the subject alternative names. As an example, google.de and google.com. Google would just say, okay, the subject alternative name should be google.com. And if that was the case, then you don't need an additional certificate because then it's also valid for other names. Also, it is very essential to know that the common name also has to be in the subject alternative names. That's imperative. So for the past 10 years, that's been the standard, and that's also something that browsers are doing now. So they don't actually like it if it is not in there. So the subject alternative name definitely has to be there, so it is mandatory. Okay, one more detail I'd like to mention. Well, it's really not a detail, but what happens if those certificates are compromised, right? If the private key was stolen, for example, or something like that. So if I just say I'm the certification authority and I say, unfortunately, the certificates I issued, they're all invalid now. If that's the case, there are two lists that are also in these extensions, so it can be quite a few of them. And overall, those are just lists that you can check and you can see, okay, is the certificate still valid, the certificate I have in front of me. The disadvantage is that these lists have to be available and accessible, and the software that is checking all that has to actively check. So that means that that's being criticized a little bit. That's why I don't want to talk about it in detail today. However, it is very important to make sure that the validity is limited. Usually, those certificates are always limited to 1 year's time, sometimes even shorter than that, just to make sure that compromised certificates aren't just out there for an endless amount of time. So how do I actually implement all of that? And also, if I have my server and I want to get a certificate, what do I do? Well, first of all, there are self-signed certificates. Like I said, that is really not all that helpful when it comes to the authentication process. I can encrypt doing that. However, if I really set up my server myself and I am making sure that the infrastructure is there, and if I am also the person to receive the certificate from an authority and I can import it to my software, then of course it's going to work with self-signed certificates as well. Or also if you just want to test it, if you just say, okay, I want to set up an SSL connection, for example, or something like that, then you would do that, then you can just use self-signed certificates. There's another option. So if it's bigger companies, for example, and I think many of you know that probably, it's sort of like a company CA. So we have a certification authority for that specific company, and if that's available to you, then usually that's a very good situation because the root certificates that go with it, they're usually rolled out on the company computers. The IT department usually does that, and if you then have a server with an SSL certificate, if you want to get get the SSL certificate, what you do is you just ask the IT department to give you that certificate or issue that certificate, and usually they just make that available for you if you give them the corresponding information, of course. And the public version, which is the most common option, is just, the public certification authority. The big advantage here is that they work with any common software, so the root certificates that are issued by these certification authorities are typically working if you have a current browser and current software. So all you have to do is you just have to use your browser in order for them to be verified. And they're available by Let's Encrypt, free of charge, and also there are some that are incredibly expensive, always depending on the size of the company and also depending on the information that you want to be verified. So the free versions can do it free of charge because they also don't put a lot of work into verifying the identity. That means usually you just send an email there and they verify, okay, this email address does exist. And if it's just a bigger certification authority, they do it differently. What they do is you just have to go through an actual audit. And by doing that, I mean, you can also tell your customers that you really are who they want to connect to, right? If you, for example, do online banking or something like that, you should always make sure that you have a more expensive certificate. Okay, so what's very interesting in this case is how do I use all of this in CheckMK? Well, there are two pages, two sides. On the one side, I have the CheckMK server that I want to connect to, and I have to issue the server certificate and then also make the whole certification chain available. And on the other side, I have my server, my CheckMK server, and also my CheckMK state. I connect to different servers, and I want to secure that connection using SSL. So the second case I just mentioned, in this case, CheckMK would be the client. In that case, there are global settings, as you can see, and there is site management. So there's this dialog, trusted certificate for SSL. So in this case, you can import your root certificates, the root certificates that you do trust. So it says add new CA certificate or chain. Chain is an option just because sometimes certification authorities send you the whole certification chain, so you can just import that. The only thing you have to pay attention to, if there's something on the server that is, from the chain in the Apache configuration, for example, you should just make sure that the private key is not in there, because that should definitely not end up here. And then you have to check that box right here, trust system-wide, because that's for the certificate store of the Linux distribution and also the ETC SSL. That means you can also use those straight away if you just have that installation and also the underlying operating system. So what is that going to look like? If you now look at all these different SSL connections that you might find, so the LDAP user directory where you get your users from, that's now secured by SSL. So if I now have the distributed monitoring, so I'm now talking about a way-to configuration. In that case, the master then has to trust its slave sites. If I have active checks, for example, check HTTP, and HTTPS is secured by SSL, data source programs. So we're talking about special agents now. Of course, in this case, you can also have an SSL connection. Other than that, everything where we find anything that is called use SSL or secure this connection using SSL. In this case, we always refer back to our global settings. So for 1.4, maybe it's not going to be rolled out everywhere, but for 1.5, it's definitely our goal to make it where it's rolled out everywhere, where we just have this information use SSL so that we can always refer back to global settings. So that's just our own certificate store, if you want to call it that. That's rolled out by CheckMK. The other side, if we now want to secure our server, the server we're connecting to, there are two options of doing so. Either I have an OMD installation, in that case the system Apache is running, and in that case I would have to manually configure it. That means I have to give them my certificate chain, also my private key that the server also needs in order to do the TLS handshake. And of course, that is just an Apache configuration. So you would have to just read the documentation as to how that works. It's easier if you just have an appliance and if you use the CheckMK appliance, because in that case, you could just do it using the web interface. So device setting, web access. And if you navigate there, this is what it looks like. You see one side right here, so there is a self-signed certificate that I just imported as an example. However, you also end up on this page right now where you can either create a new certificate, you can upload one that you've already created, or you can also download when it's available to you. And then you can choose how you want to access your appliance on your server. So I just used HTTP and HTTPS. That is useful, well, not very useful when it comes to security, but it is useful if I want to import my certificate to just try it out and then just access it optionally on HTTP. Because if I only go to HTTPS only and there's an error in my certificate, I'm going to lock myself out as soon as I click on save. So I really can't win in that case. So in order to test it, it makes a lot of sense. Other than that, HTTPS only or HTTPS enforced. If I now click on the new certificate, I'm going to end up right here in this area. So in this case, I can choose all the different areas that we saw earlier in order to identify our server. And we also have the subject alternative name, so you have to make sure that the common name is also mirrored here, just to let you know again, that's very important. And now you can say either, yes, I'm going to handle it myself and I'm going to roll out the certificate and make it available. So I am going to do the self-assigned certificate, or instead you can also create a signing request. And you need that quite often, or the certification authorities actually want that to be done in CSR, and then you can just do that, right here. So that's the digital form that you can use. So you can generate that in the appliance. If you now created your server certificate, you can go to Upload Certificate.
And in this case, we can make all the information available that we need. If we had to configure our Apache, we'd need the same set of information. So we have to make the private key available and the server certificate itself. And then also depending on the certification chain, and also whether or not it's there or if it's ending with the certification authority, I also get a certificate chain right here that I have to make available. So let's remember that the server has to make the certification chain available to the client so that the client can actually go through the whole chain and then actually verify the whole chain all the way up to the server. So if we now configured our CheckMK server with HTTPS or an SSL certificate, then we have some application users. So, for example, we can visit our site in browser, of course, only if our server trusts the certificate. So if it's not a public CA, And what's also very popular is that we connect via the agent updater. So there's a special case right here, the agent updater. If I configure that, and if I create that rule, I choose whether or not I want to choose HTTP or HTTPS. My recommendation is HTTPS. However, I also have to make the certificate itself available as well. The reason for that is that it's just bypassing the typical application use. So either I secure my server or I am connecting to an additional body, because right here the client is actually on many different hosts, and then you just have to roll out the certificates again. However, the other side of the distributed monitoring is, so the WATO part, so you also just secure your side. Okay, so it's sort of limited to those two topics right here in terms of check and K. And now I wanted to look at how these, or what these certificates look like, and also
wie kann ich mir meine Verbindung mal so ein bisschen angucken und analysieren. Da gibt es das Tool OpenSSL, das steht in der Linux-Unix-Welt eigentlich grundsätzlich zur Verfügung. Unter Windows müsste man es manuell installieren, geht aber auch.
And yeah, I just have two useful commands for you. So, from my experience, when it comes to support of the agent updater, I can say that there are two commands that I can really solve 95% of all SSL errors. I can at least find them, analyze them, most of the time also use them. That's the connection to the server first. It's the OpenSSL client, and I give them my URL that I'm connecting to, and it's also very important that it's .443 or the port that I configured SSL on, but usually it's 443. And another thing that I do get is the certification chain, the certificate chain. I can look at that. And I can just make sure, okay, is there my common name? Is it the URL that I want to connect to? And does it look like the certificate chain? Meaning, is this issuer right here, is this the same one as the subject of the next certificate? And I just have the chain structure right here that I can look at. Also, up here, what I see is just the connection data. So, is it an ongoing chain from the root certificate all the way to my URL? And it tells me every time verify return. So number one in this case is yes, it's okay, and it's verified. So you can also see where the chain actually stops or is interrupted. Then you also see the service certificate itself. I just abbreviated a little bit, it's a little bit longer usually. And you also see the data subject and issuer of the certificate itself. And then also the connection data that you can also analyze if you want to. So what you see here is just the whole SSL session, all this data from the handshake as we saw it earlier, and then at the end it's also telling us whether or not everything worked or not. So in this case it's A0 for OK. And of course you can also
eine Option
do an option
-CA-File oder -CA-Path mitgeben, wo man dann explizit noch Root-Zertifikate übergibt, falls die eben dem OpenSSL nicht zur Verfügung stehen. Standardmäßig verbindet der sich auf seinen Certificate Store vom Betriebssystem.
The other side, if we look at that, we now want to see if the certificate I imported is the right certificate. In that case, you can use OpenSSL X509, and then you show the certificate. So I just use the certificate that was at the end of the certificate chain that we just saw. Typically, it's under Linux,
also beziehungsweise unter Debian
Systemen liegt es meistens unter
etc certs.
Other distributions might be a little bit differently, but it might also be similar or the same path. And if I look at that, I see everything that we saw in the overview earlier. So what kind of fields are in the X509 certificate? So those are exactly the ones that we saw earlier. So if I wanted
Wenn
to
ich jetzt
check if
gucken
it's the
möchte,
right
ob es sich um das
certificate,
richtige Zertifikat handelt,
I would just
ja klar, da
check,
muss ich
okay,
mal
is the
gucken, ist der Issuer
issuer the
denn
same
der
one
gleiche,
as the one that
auf
I
den
saw
ich vorhin
earlier
gestoßen
when
bin, als
I
ich mir
looked at
meine
my certificate
Zertifikatskette
chain?
angeguckt habe?
If not, then we
Wenn
already
nicht, ist der
found the
Fehler schon
error.
gefunden.
And in addition to that,
Des
if it's a
Weiteren,
root
wenn es sich um ein
certificate,
Root-Zertifikat handelt, ist das
it's
Ganze
just
selbstdefiniert.
self-signed, so
Issuer ist
issuer
gleich
equals
Subject.
subject. And it's also
Hier
very
auch
interesting
relativ
to see right
interessant zu
here that
sehen,
the
dieses
certificate
Zertifikat
is
ist
valid for
sehr
a very
lange
long time.
gültig.
And
Wenn dieses
once
Zertifikat
it's no
ungültig
longer
wird, dann muss
valid,
ich
everything that
alles,
I
was ich
signed
damit
with
drunter
it,
signiert habe,
so all the
sämtliche
different certificate chains that were
Zertifikatsketten, die
set
sich
up, and that
aufgebaut
can be
haben, und
quite
das
a
sind
few,
durchaus viele,
all of them I'm going to have to
muss ich wieder neu
recreate,
erstellen,
and I'm
muss
going to
ich
have to
wieder
sign
komplett
them
neu signieren.
again. That means
Das heißt,
that,
es ist
well, like I said, it's
wie gesagt,
essentially
es ist
important
essentiell wichtig,
that
dass
the
die
root certificates
Root-Zertifikate
are
gut unter Verschluss sind, also
kept
nicht die
well,
Zertifikate,
so the
sondern die
private
Private Keys,
keys
die dem
are the
Ganzen
basis of
zugrunde
everything.
liegen.
And yeah, like I said,
Wie
because of
gesagt, und
that,
dementsprechend auch
it's
diese lange
valid for such a long
Gültigkeit.
period of time. One more detail
Noch
I'd
ein
like to
Detail,
mention is right here under
hier unter den
extensions, we can
Extensions
see
sehen wir eben
something
auch,
that
was darauf
shows
hindeutet,
us that basic
Basic
constraints
Constraints
CA
are
true,
true. Hier
so it means
steht,
that it
es
is
handelt sich
a
um eine
certification authority,
beziehungsweise ich kann
and that
damit
means that I
eben
can also
weitere
sign
Zertifikate
more
signieren.
certificates with
Bei dem
that,
Server-Zertifikat
and
würde hier
the
falsch
server
stehen,
certificate
weil
would
damit
say false
signiere ich
because I'm
nichts
not going
mehr.
to sign with that. The key usage certificate sign, CRL sign, so that means yes,
Das heißt, ja,
I
ich kann
can sign
Zertifikate
certificates.
signieren.
And
Naja,
another
und
thing
was da
that's also
letztendlich auch noch
included is
drin
just the
steckt, ist die
signature. You
Signatur,
see
die
that
wird
as
hier auch noch
well.
angezeigt.
If
Wenn man
you
OpenSSL
have OpenSSL
mit
with
entsprechenden Optionen noch genug
options,
streichelt,
it
dann
also
zeigt
shows
er
you
einem
the
auch noch den
public
Public
key
Key
that's
an, der da
included.
drin steckt.
And it also
Der sagt einem
tells
aber
you, well,
natürlich
it doesn't
genauso
tell
wenig wie der
you as much as the
Signaturalgorithmus und die Signatur
signature
selber.
sender and the algorithm.
Dann
Now,
noch
very
ganz
quickly,
kurz, wenn man
you
mit
work with
Zertifikaten
certificates,
hantiert, dann trifft
you
man
also
eben
see
auch auf verschiedene
different file
Dateiformate.
formats. The
Das
most common one
bekannteste Format und das sich am meisten
is
durchgesetzt hat,
specifically in Linux
besonders in der
is
Linux-Welt,
PEM.
ist eben das PEM-Format.
And you
Das
recognize that
erkennt
because
man
of this
an diesem schönen Text.
text.
Begin
Certificate, End Certificate,
Begin
RSA Private Key, and End
RSA Private Key. Das heißt, da kann ich
key.
letztendlich
So that means that you
alle
can save all the
Strukturen drin
different
speichern. Da kann ich
structures.
Keys drin
You can
speichern,
also
da kann ich
save
Zertifikate drin
certificates.
speichern, da kann ich
You can also save
Requests
requests,
drin speichern, die Signing Requests.
and all of that is
Das
in
Ganze
text
ist im
format.
Textformat.
That means
Das
that I
heißt,
can
ich
send it
kann das
via
Ganze per E-Mail
email.
verschicken,
I'm
bin
not
nicht von
dependent on
irgendeiner
a
Plattform
platform,
abhängig.
and because of that, that's the
Deswegen hat
most
sich das auch
commonly one
durchgesetzt, sozusagen
that
als
is
das
used,
wichtigste
the one that's most commonly used.
Austauschformat.
Then we
Dann
also
gibt es
have
noch
the
das
DER format.
DER-Format,
That's the
das ist
same
im Prinzip
thing,
das Gleiche,
but
nur
it's
dass
just
es
not
eben
the
nicht im
text
Textformat
format.
ist,
It's
es
not
ist nicht Base64 encoded.
encoded.
Das Ganze
And because of
kann
that,
ich
it's not
eben
so
nicht so
easy
einfach
to
verschicken.
send to somebody. You can
Also
send
ich
it
kann
as
es
a
als
file,
Datei
but not
verschicken, aber
as
nicht als
text.
Text.
And down
Und
here,
ich habe
I
hier unten
also
nochmal einen
have
kleinen Befehl angegeben,
something to show
wie ich
you
denn
how
auf
you
das
can get to the PEM
PEM-Zertifikat komme,
certificate,
was
and that's a lot
sehr viel
easier
einfacher
to
zu
manage
handhaben
or
ist.
handle. Then there are two
Und dann
more
gibt es noch zwei weitere
formats,
Formate, PKCS7
PKCS
und
7 and 12.
PKCS12.
So those are two
Noch zwei
formats,
Formate,
where one of
wo
them
das
is
eine eben
also
auch noch
available
in
in text
Textformat
format. The
vorliegt,
other one is
das
a
andere wieder ein
binary
Binary-Format,
and
das
this is sort of like a
ist eher so ein
container format
Container-Format,
that's
das ist
password protected,
passwortverschlüsselt, das
and
da
that's what
trifft
you
man auf
find
Windows
on
drauf, wenn
Windows
man seine
you
Zertifikate und
import your
Zertifikatsketten
certificates and
importiert und
certificate chains, and
exportiert.
also when you export
Hier
them.
sind wir auch
So this
ziemlich
is again
im
Windows
Windows-Bereich
or
oder
Tomcat servers.
Tomcat-Server. Genau.
Just so you've heard
Nur,
it
dass man es
before
auch
and you're
mal
not going to be
gesehen hat und sich
surprised
nicht wundert,
if
wenn man
you
hier
get
komische
strange
Dateinamenerweiterungen hat
file
und
names and
eigentlich
you
ein
expected a
Zertifikat erwartet
certificate.
hat und
You
da
know, you
drin
don't see
nichts
anything in there that
Sinnvolles
makes
sieht.
sense. Yeah.
Ja,
So this is the
dann bin
end
ich
of my
eigentlich mit meinem kleinen
presentation.
Vortrag hier ziemlich
I
am Ende.
have
Ich habe noch
a couple
ein paar
sources that I included
Quellen hier
right here.
angezeigt,
So
also hier
this
die
is the
X509
specification for
Spezifikation.
X509. If you
Wer
want
sich
to
das
look at that,
antun möchte,
please
darf
feel free
das
to
gerne
read
mal
through that. It's
durchlesen. Das sind
150
150
pages.
Seiten.
Like I
Wie
said,
gesagt,
it's
liest sich
sort
wie
of
ein
like
Telefonbuch.
reading a phone book. And one link
Ein
out
Link
of
von
many
vielen der mal beschreibt, wie kann ich mir meine eigene Certification Authority erstellen.
It's very
ist relativ
detailed,
detailliert,
but
aber findet man im
find lots of
Internet eigentlich
information
nichts am
online. And then we also have
Die
Wikipedia articles
Wikipedia-Artikel
for
für die
the
Grundlage
basis
für
of
TLS und X509 sind auch durchaus lesenswert, auch ähnliche Wikipedia-Artikel, die in die Richtung gehen. Und ansonsten wollte ich mich da jetzt nicht verkünsteln und 1000 Links angeben. Man findet bei Google 1000 Links, die alle wahrscheinlich schönere Präsentationen hier zutage fördern als meine. Und unter YouTube findet man auch noch ganz tolle Videos, die man sich angucken kann. Genau,
So now
zum Schluss
the
noch das
small
Kleingedruckte.
And yeah,
Und
so thank you very much
dann
for your
sage ich vielen
attention.
Dank und
If you have questions,
erwarte
go
eure
ahead.
Fragen zu dem Thema.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. I have two questions actually, but the most important question for me is the CA, Internet CA, creates certificates for 2 years. So what do we have to do in the agent updater if my web server replaces the public key? If I want to replace it, I think the private key stays the same, if I understand it correctly. Well, overall,
Im Prinzip, also
a
ein
public
Public Key tauscht
you
man
don't
ja
replace that
sowieso nicht aus, sondern das ist
because
ja in das
that's
gesamte
part of the
Zertifikat
whole
verbacken.
certificate.
Also
So overall, you get
letztendlich
a
bekommst du ein
certificate
Zertifikat
or
bzw.
a
eine
certificate
Zertifikatskette
and then
und dann
have to
musst du
figure out
irgendwie herausfinden, was denn hier am
what's
Ende
at the
deiner
end of your certificate
Zertifikatskette
chain.
steht.
There's
Da steht
some
irgendein
kind of certificate
Root-Zertifikat
down here, a root
und
certificate,
das muss
and that
letztendlich
has to
beim
be
Agent
imported in
Updater
the
importiert
agent
sein.
updater. So
Also
it's
es kann auch
possible
durchaus sein, dass
that
das
the
Zertifikat,
certificate
das ausgetauscht wird,
or
das
has to be
erneuert wird,
renewed,
dass
that
es eben
it's
von so
just
einem
by an intermediate certificate that's
Zertifikat
signed
unterschrieben
properly.
wurde.
And then it's
Da kann es
possible that the
durchaus sein, dass
certificate
das
at the end of the
Zertifikat hier am
chain
Ende der Kette
is
sich
not
überhaupt gar nicht
changing.
ändert.
So what's
Also
important for the
wichtig zur
verification of the
Verifikation der
connection
Verbindung
is
ist eben
that
das
the
Zertifikat am Ende der Kette.
certificate at the end of the chain is correct. Okay, so it's only checking the chain, that the chain is correct, that the certificates are signed, but it doesn't do any certificate binning. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but it's just checking the certificate. Is that correct? Well, overall,
Letztendlich läuft das, also im Agent Updater läuft das eigentlich letztendlich über Standardsoftware. Das heißt, wir haben da ein Python-Modul dahinter, das guckt sich das Zertifikat an. Also wenn im Zertifikat irgendwie Quatsch steht oder das einfach nicht passt, dann schmeißt er das einem auch um die Ohren. Also er guckt sich das Zertifikat schon an natürlich.
So I think with the agent updater, there is something special about it because we have the NI problem. So that means if you have the root certificate that expires and you then only put in the new one, then the agent updater is not going to trust the old one anymore, and then you can't update it, and the update would then include the new one. Unfortunately, I can't hear the question because he's not using a microphone. I'm sorry.
Okay, also das Intermediate CA müsste...
Okay, very briefly.
Ganz kurz vielleicht dazu.
Are you only checking the validity of the certificate, or are you also checking the certificate itself, and the certificate has a specific serial number and things like that?
Nein, also
No,
es
there's
findet
no
kein
certificate
Zertifikatspinning
pinning,
statt,
but the
sondern das
certificate
Zertifikat wird natürlich von der
is
vom
delivered by
Wato
Wato
geliefert
and then checked on the
auf dem
client, and the
überprüft.
client
Der
only
Client
needs
braucht
the
nur
intermediate
das Intermediate-Zertifikat
certificate or the root certificate that doesn't expire, but the certificate of the server expires. So the only thing you have to do if the certificate of the server is expired, you then have to replace it on the server, but not on the clients. You don't have to do anything. You only have to do something on the clients. The agents only have to be updated if the root certificate or the intermediate certificate expires. Yeah, Ralf, but the intermediate certificate, if there's a connection deployed, right? Yeah, but from the server. Yes, that's correct.
Ja, genau.
But the intermediate certificate doesn't expire. It's the server certificate that does expire. Yes, correct.
Also auf dem Server hinterlegt
Okay, so
ist
this is
diese
the
ganze
whole certificate chain, and
Zertifikatskette.
the
Also das
server
muss mir der
has
Server auch
to
jedes Mal
give me
mitliefern,
that every time,
weil
because
es
not
ist nicht
every
jedes
intermediate
Intermediate-Zertifikat auf jedem
is
Client
important on
importiert.
each
Das
client.
kann
That's not
überhaupt
even
gar nicht
possible
geleistet
at
werden.
all.
Also
So what you do need in
was
order to
man braucht
verify
zur
is this root
Verifikation ist
certificate.
dieses
That's what's
Root-Zertifikat.
important. If that
Und wenn sich
doesn't
das nicht
change,
ändert,
then it's
dann
just
läuft das
still going
eben
to work on the
weiterhin auch auf
client.
dem
But if it
Client.
does change,
Wenn sich's ändert, sollte
then
das
the
das
new
Neue
one has
vorher
to be
zusätzlich
accepted beforehand in
Richtig.
addition, then roll it
dann
out
ausrollen,
so that
sodass
the
der
agent
noch
trusts
beiden
both,
vertraut. Genau, aber nur,
but
wenn sich
only
wirklich
if the
das
absolute root
Absolute-Zertifikat
certificate
ändert.
changes, because then you wouldn't have to
Dann
do
müsstest du
anything.
eigentlich nichts tun müssen. Dann
Then you wouldn't have to do anything,
du
but
eigentlich nichts tun,
please
aber probier's
make
vorher
sure
aus,
that
ob
I'm
es
right first. Please do
Also
check
liegt
that
auf
I'm
dem
right.
Server, bis die Zertifikate ausgetauscht werden.
Okay, so overall,
Genau, also
the
letztendlich ist der Agent bzw. der
Updater
Agent
is
Updater
also
ist
just a
auch einfach nur ein
client
Client,
that does
der
exactly the
macht
same
genau
thing
das
as
Gleiche
the
wie der
Firefox or
Firefox
Chrome
oder
or
der Chrome
Internet
oder der
Explorer.
Internet
It's
Explorer.
a
Das ist eine
software.
Software.
Even
Also auf der
programmers, well,
Programmiererseite haben wir
programmers haven't
nichts
done anything
gemacht,
other
außer
than
der
tell the
Software zu
software, this is
sagen,
the
hier ist
certificate,
das
and please
Zertifikat
do
und
verify it for
verifiziere
me.
das bitte für
And
mich.
that means
Das heißt, es
that
folgt ganz
this is
standardmäßig nach
exactly
diesem
the
Schema.
scheme that's going to happen
Und
every time.
sofern ich mich auf meinen
you can
Check-in-Car-Server
still connect to
immer
your
noch
Check-in-K
verbinden kann
server
über
using the
den
browser and nothing has
Browser und
changed
sich da
there,
nichts geändert hat,
the agent
sollte das
should
mit dem
still work
Agent
as
auch
well.
funktionieren.
Genau,
But
nur sollte man sich getäuscht haben,
of course,
ist die Arbeit
if you
wesentlich
are wrong,
größer.
then of course
Man muss
it's going to
alle
be a lot
Erkenntnisse
of
von
work
Hand
because you have to
anpassen.
touch every
Sehr
agent
guter Punkt,
separately.
dass wir da eben einen
maybe
Zwischenschritt
there
gehen und
is
beide
an interim step.
Zertifikate
You have to
importieren
import
und
both
dann, wenn wir
certificates
uns
and then
erst
only
sicher sind,
kick
das
it off
rausschmeißen.
once you're
Vielleicht auch mal mit
really sure. Maybe check out
OpenSSL drauf
OpenSSL
gucken, ob es wirklich das ist, was wir
to make sure that it is what
dachten,
we
was
thought it
es
is,
ist, weil
because
es
it's
könnte ja
possible
sein,
that
dass unser
our
altes
old
Zertifikat
certificate
noch
is still
gültig
valid
ist
and the
und
new
das
one
neue
is, and then
nicht.
we're going to kick
Dann
out the
schmeißen wir
old
das
one and
alte
then we'll
raus
have a
und dann
big
stehen wir
problem.
da.
Specifically, if the
Besonders
number
wenn die
of
Zahl der
hosts
Hosts in die
is
Höhe steigt,
increasing, it
ist
could
es
be a
vielleicht
very
uns ärgerlich.
negative situation. Okay, so if
Also
you
zumindest auch wenn man
have
eine
your
eigene PKI
own
betreibt, wenn man dann
IP,
so,
if you see a
so eine CA
CA
sieht
or an
oder eine
intermediate CA
Intermediate
that's
CA,
only
die nur
valid
2
for 2
Jahre
years,
läuft, dann
then you
hat
might
man
have done
vielleicht was
something
falsch
wrong
gemacht.
because it should be
Weil das
valid
sollte mindestens so lange laufen, bis
as
der Administrator in Rente ist.
the administrator is still working. So until
Ja,
they
im Prinzip
retire,
schon,
it
ja.
should be valid.
Gut.
Okay, good. All right, thank you very much for your
danke
attention.
für die
We have a
Aufmerksamkeit. Wir haben
short
jetzt noch eine
break
kurze
now,
Pause.
and then we're going to have
vielen
the
Dank.
last
Kommen dann zum letzten
presentation. Thank you very
Vortrag.
much,
Vielen Dank,
Andi,
Andi.
and see you in a little
Und
bit.
bis gleich.